She walks through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong, black, and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses written over 5 years, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labor of love that would remain my final mystery. But the poem's subject is, herself, a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who steals a little more of my soul every night, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through the silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mold my burgeoning talent while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage hormones. For years, I'd been told that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that it lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. That's what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment, a short story about the ideas of servitude but not slavery, right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper. Miss Harper had often told me that I had talent, and told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the writer trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic table outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of those threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before, and dreamed vividly as I did sometimes. In the dreams, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day, I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey at school in your underwear sort of thing, but the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater sometimes, everything having a slightly wavy feeling to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive, but at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world. Several times as I whipped around suddenly, I could see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me 2 things. She was human, and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me. Her very secrecy, humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her, not turning to speak or looking for her, but just studying her out of the corner of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple white shirt with no particular design. She seemed to be about my age, but could have been older, I suppose. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in my mind. Like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote those 4 lines. I wouldn't revisit her for another 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelter is not solely her own. I have seen what lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl was what I had named her after the second verse, had lit a fire in me, it seemed. Suddenly, I wrote pieces for every school contest, submitted poems for every poetry club event, and I gained a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that followed in those circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers noticed my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside of my high school community. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days, crafting the perfect poem, the most significant work of my life. When I hit send on the submission email, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the efforts of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into the deep and untroubled sleep of the dead for 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of the high school and saw the ethereal backdrop of my dream again. I was comfortable here. It was comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was a change from the steady flow of ideas and couplets running through my head lately. But something was missing. I looked behind me, expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me. But she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember truly being alone in this place. And it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed. But I felt my steps taking me steadily into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream would take me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed the place's unusual stillness. Thump, 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 then silence. A few minutes or hours or days would pass, and then it would happen again. Thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the thumping was probably coming from the boiler room. It was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians for storing extra chemicals or broken machinery that they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of a less academic cast went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realized I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handle, though, I was immediately thrown backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling through that door. It was her, the dream girl, and she turned to glare at me, teeth bared in a feral challenge. When she saw who I was, she stopped growling and scrambled down the hall towards my English class. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listened to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. I'm familiar with lucid dreaming, and probably led to me becoming a little too comfortable in this dream. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realized a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of those fears, and as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first few words of our strange relationship, "If you don't want to die, then you'd better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later, we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors. It sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us, chewing up everything that got in its way. My guide took us down a hallway that led to another hallway that led to another hallway, taking corners at random before finally wrenching open the door to the custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She closed the door behind us, cracking it a little as she peeked out into the hallway. All I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall becoming tired in a dream before, and as I sat, I realized my butt still hurt where I had hit it. I wanted to ask things. wanted to know what was chasing us and why it was chasing us, but as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway as a creature like nothing I had ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was shadow. It was darkness. And as its form slither crawled past us, I looked at its amorphous boundlessness. She closed the door quietly before it came even with us, and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" She looked at me quizzically, and I feared that she was incapable of hearing me for a moment. I would later come to realize how long it had been since she had actually had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savor the sounds my words made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell that it likes. And when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me, "I don't know. I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here." Her voice was thick with disuse, but it was cultured with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me that she believed she was 16, but she couldn't be sure. She told me that she'd been here for as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. "Between dreams?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Instead of telling me, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall started to melt away. Suddenly, there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness. We were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on to infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into the landscape of fragrant technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school closed. "Where are we?" She shrugged. "Some other dream. She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know we're here." I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organize right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me, and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of a precipice, looking at the world from afar. I am a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as dazed relief. They thought I was happy. They thought I was living in the clouds. In my mind, however, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analyzing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream, and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that had led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped, but it was no use. 2 weeks later, I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt, the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused, I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in the high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, like old dust or sour memories or the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice I heard relief. Her world lies alongside my own, my dreams the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed. She took me back to the field of flowers. Then she answered my questions. I asked her probably about 1,000,000 questions as we sat together in the field. She had found a tree that sprang from the flowers, and we sat there as she told me her story. Till that moment, I believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years. But as she spoke, her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I guess. I now realize she was afraid that telling it to me would make it real. She'd had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember there being a before. She had dreamed inside a castle and was a princess, with knights and wizards at her command, dragons and goblins that needed slaying. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favor. Sometimes she put on armor and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them. You can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world, the after. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time. Years, she said. Then, one day, something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edge of her kingdom, and it had actually killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always come along to heal them. When they didn't come back, and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights, it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it just looked wrong. I hid inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She'd thrown her splayed hand out against the wall of the castle as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared in the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she jumped through it without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind, her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep actually, but as for eating and drinking, she found that she didn't need those things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, but she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was one of the first people to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed her, believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her for my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell them who she was. They believed that she was someone at the school that I was spending my nights with. I had people who had read my works asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave them very little information. For her part, I could tell that she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get too close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I could scarcely describe them. But she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasions, though, and I remembered being filled with a warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our nights would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us and screamily suck his way around, groping, as we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him and said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that she would never really be safe as long as it existed. As time passed, I noticed her become more and more melancholy. The one night I asked what was troubling her, she took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like 1,000 years. "I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that I won't be left alone when the dawn comes. I want to leave this place. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life." She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. She longs to leave her forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps. I was in my senior year when she left forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know so well, and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep. When she turned to look at me, though, I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realized that something had happened while I was gone. I think I need to destroy the shade. She detailed her plans, how if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of life, but she wouldn't hear of it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. "I thought you were different. I thought you understood how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going, with or without you." She walked out, and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I found myself fighting sleep for the next few days. By then, I was almost out of high school, about to start college, in fact, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since early in the year. I woke up to my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days, I drank coffee, took caffeine pills. My face stung from where I had slapped it, and I fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me, but the thought that she might become something worse after she killed the shade scared me even more. Eventually, I lost the battle, and I was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one. The silence was oppressive. In the ethereal halls, I wonder, the only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom, every mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name as I threw caution to the wind, wanting nothing but the solace of her voice, of her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, to apologize for my cowardice, a cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar. But I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going into that basement to settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem, and if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so he can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl. I nearly drowned 2 weeks ago. and it changed my life. My family moved out to Mercy Shores recently. It's a little peninsula down in Washington, with 2 hardware stores, a Walmart, and not much else. Mom and Dad grew up in San Diego, amongst the hustle and bustle of city life, and decided they wanted to retire somewhere a little quieter. I had been their last child, a total surprise to both of them at 40. Now that they were 55, they felt it was time to retire and enjoy their golden years. So they moved me 400 miles away from my friends, my school, and anyone I had ever known, so they could enjoy those golden years. We moved into a beach house of sorts. It was a 2-story, the second floor a loft that overlooked the ocean out of a big round bay window. They gave me the loft and took a larger room downstairs with a less spectacular view, knowing I was not happy about leaving my friends behind. I guess my parents were trying to placate me, so I set up my meager possessions that I had brought with us, the moving truck being a couple of days behind. As I set about finding a home for things, I found myself drawn to the big bay window that overlooked our little stretch of beach. The shore was far from picturesque. Not quite as pretty as the California beaches, Mercy Shore was stony and a little bleak looking. I didn't doubt the water would be cold and clear, but it would also likely have rocks, and maybe crabs scuttling underfoot. There was a tall jut of rock just off the coast, about 50 feet from the shore. I found my gaze drawn there again and again. It looked like nothing so much as a tall throne, fit for a giant. The seat was smooth from many tides. I almost thought I could see a little hollow in the back of the throne. The throne wasn't quite large enough for caves, but there was a narrow fluted passage in the throne's back that would likely fill with water when the waves crushed over it. Those waves woke me up that first night. The crashing of the breakers jarred me awake. I realized that they were so loud because I'd left the window open. As I slid it shut, my eyes were caught by the moon as it cast its glow on the stone throne. As I closed the window, I saw something moving in the water. The lean shape crested up and out of the water like a sea serpent, and as it came up, I could see it was a girl. Her hair was long and silvery and lovely. She ran her fingers through it as I stared at her, and she seemed to feel my gaze as she floated like a specter in the dark water. She looked up at me, her smile wide and inviting, and waved a single pale hand at my window. I waved back, and when she slipped under the water this time, she didn't come back up. When I woke up the next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The next day, Mom and Dad wanted to go antiquing in town. I told them I didn't want to go, and they didn't act too put out by my refusal. It was pretty clear they didn't want a complaining teen tagging along and ruining their trip. I waved to them from the front porch as they left before moving upstairs to relax a little. I sat in the window seat of my new room, reading and watching the waves crash, when I saw some people walking down with blankets and coolers. They started setting up their stuff, and I noticed most of them looked around my age. On a whim, I decided to talk to them. What was the worst that could happen? I slipped on a pair of comfy shorts and headed out. The beachgoers tensed when they saw the door open, but they relaxed a little when they realized I wasn't an adult. I introduced myself and learned that they were Matt, Stuart, Kyle, and Roger. They had apparently been coming to this beach for quite a while and said it was a favorite hangout spot for them. Sorry for intruding. Throne Beach has been empty for years, and the old lady who used to live here always let us play here when we were kids, Matt explained. Matt looked like he'd be at home on any California beach. Board shorts, long brown hair cut in that way that's half bowl cut and half natural, a surfboard next to his blanket, and a smile for anyone. Stuart was tall, gangly almost, with buck teeth and thick glasses. He was very pale, and I got the impression that they had dragged him out from under a rock to hang out with his friends. Kyle and Roger looked like a couple of classic Chads. Snap brim hats, sculpted physiques, gold chains, board shorts, the works. They slapped my hand when I went to shake theirs and roared with laughter when I looked a little confused. We became friends in that effortless way teens often do. I hung out with them for the rest of the day. We swam, the water was cold and stony, as I had thought it would be, and played frisbee with a big red disc that Roger had brought. I invited them in for lunch, and we sat on the blankets and munched cold sandwiches and chips. The sun was starting to work its way across the sky as we ate. I noticed that mine wasn't the only eye drawn to the big rock out there. Matt was studying it intently as he ate, and it almost seemed like he was looking for something out there. "It's pretty cool," I said, taking a bite of bologna as he looked over at me. "The rock, I mean." Matt nodded. "Oh, Matt just thinks it's cool because he thought he saw a girl out there," Roger crowed. Matt shot him a murderous look, but I was interested. "A girl?" Matt blew out a big long breath. "Well, it happened a few years ago. I was out here swimming with Kyle and Roger, and the waves were a little rougher than I thought they were. We had all been daring each other to swim out to the rock and back. We had all done it since we were young. I was on my way back, and a huge wave crashed over me and drove me under. I kicked my legs and tried to right myself, but the waves kept crashing down. I was underwater, running out of air, and as my lungs cried out, I felt hands catch me. Someone lifted me and swam me to the shore. I was on my knees, hacking up water and struggling for breath. I looked back at the water and saw a girl swimming away. Kyle and Roger came running up then, and when I looked back, she was gone." Kyle snickered, but I was curious. "What did she look like?" "She had long hair, maybe blonde or silver. She looked young. I remember thinking that she was about my age. Her hands felt strong but cold, and I've been keeping an eye out for her ever since. I keep hoping maybe she'll come back." His eyes glazed over a little then, and he stared back at the throne-shaped rock hopefully. I heard my dad honk the horn on his old truck then, and my new friends turned to see my parents coming up the drive. They had some furniture in the back of the pickup. As Dad got out, he called me over to help him move it. I said my goodbyes and went to help, but found all four of them following behind me to my surprise. We had the furniture inside faster than expected between the five of us, and I introduced them to my parents. Mom asked if they'd like to stay for dinner, holding up a takeout Chinese food bag. "I can get some more. The place next to the antique shop smelled so good that I just had to have some." "Maybe another time, ma'am. We don't want to intrude," Matt said. He held his hands up, and I slapped it as he promised that they would see me tomorrow and see if I wanted to hang out. They cleaned up their stuff, and after another round of goodbyes, they hopped on their bikes and rolled into town. Mom smiled. "Making friends already, I see." I smiled back, realizing I had done just that. We sat around the table and ate as they told me about their day. My parents talked about the antiquing. The stores in town had a large selection, and Mom was in love with several other pieces. I told them about my new friends, and they agreed that they seemed like nice boys. I told them how lovely the beach was, and Mom said she had gotten a call from the movers saying that they would be here tomorrow afternoon with the stuff. "Maybe your friends would like to help you set up your room?" she asked. Turned out, they did. I spent that summer hanging out with my new friends. We had moved at the very end of school, and next year I would be starting 10th grade at Mercy Shores High. Matt, Stuart, Kyle, and Roger would be starting 10th grade as well. We had many of the same classes, and as the summer slipped away, Matt proposed one last beach day to celebrate the end of summer. "It's the last really warm day before fall, and we should take advantage of it." It was a great day. The sun was hot, the wind was breezy. Dad had set up a grill and was cooking hot dogs and hamburgers. Mom had found the badminton set, and we were using it to play volleyball. Mom agreed to play with us, to round the teams out, and she turned out to be really good at it. Roger, Stuart, and my mom creamed Kyle, Matt, and I 3-5, and we decided to swim a little after that. We took to the water like a school of fish, and Kyle suggested we swim to the rock. "Come on, Kyle, let's not," Matt protested. "What's the matter, Matt? You chicken?" Kyle teased. "I'll race you," I said, starting to swim for the rock as Kyle cawed angrily and lit out after me. You don't realize it from the shore, but the rock is pretty far out. It was about 30 feet from the beach, and you just don't really realize it till you're there. I had swum to the rock before, we all had, but it's never the same trip twice. I swam hard, tearing up the surf as I went, and when I got to the rock, my arms were burning. I hung to the side of the rock like a barnacle, catching my breath as Kyle closed the distance. When he was about 3 feet away, I dove back into the water and started swimming hard for the shore. I heard him yell, but I ignored him, paddling hard as I made for my friends who were bobbing near the beach. That was when something grabbed my leg. At first, I thought it was a fish that had just wandered too close, and I kicked my foot out to shoo it. When it wrapped its squishy hands around my leg again, though, it tugged me down with a strength I hadn't felt before. I was pulled under the water, dragged beneath the waves, and as I went below, I felt the air rush out of me in surprise. I kicked out, but whatever had me was fast. It dodged out of the way of my kicks and continued to drag me into the blackness below. I opened my eyes, trying to see what it was, and I was transfixed for a moment. It was a girl. It was the girl. Her hair plumed around her like a halo, and as she noticed me noticing her, she smiled at me. For a moment, it seemed like her mouth was too full of teeth, rows of needles that gleamed in the murky depths. She tugged me down, but now I very much did not want to go. I kicked again, but I was losing focus. I needed air. I was losing consciousness. As the blackness swam up before my eyes, I thought for sure I was going to drown. Then, something grabbed me under my arms and tugged me free. The next thing I was aware of was someone giving me CPR as I coughed and gurgled on the beach. Mom's face swam before me, and she smiled in relief as I came back. I sat up, still coughing, and heard someone in the water yelling for Matt. Kyle was beside me, apologizing profusely as I choked out the last of the water. I looked around and saw that Stuart was yelling at Matt as he dived under again and again, searching for something. I coughed up some water. What's wrong with Matt? Kyle looked out and sighed. He went out to save you. He dove to get you, but he came up talking about a girl he'd seen. He said she had you by the leg, and after he put you on the beach, he went out to find her again. Dad called the festivities shortly after that. Kyle and Roger hauled Matt out of the water, and the four left after saying goodbye and telling me that they were glad I was okay. Matt didn't say much of anything. He looked dazed and confused, and kept looking back at the water as they led him back to the bikes. I knew how he felt. I found myself drawn to the water after that. If I had a spare moment, or even if I didn't, I would sit by the water and listen to the waves. I couldn't get her out of my head, that beautiful creature that had grabbed me. Why had she grabbed me, I wondered. She had seemed intent on showing me something underwater. Did she want me to see something, maybe? Matt started coming around a lot more. Not to see me, not really, but I think he wanted to be close to the water too. I caught him down by the water at night sometimes, sitting by the shore or sitting by the beach. He never brought anything. It was always just sitting in the sand and staring at the water. Dad came out and shooed him more than once, and he told me to tell Matt not to sit out there at night a few days later. He could get hurt out there, and I don't want to call the cops on him for trespassing. That was the night I heard the whispery voice coming from the beach. It came through my window and seduced my ears to wakefulness. I sat up, listening, hearing a returning voice that was much less musical. It was no less familiar, though. When I looked out on the beach, I saw that Matt was on the shore and talking with someone. The someone was in the water, and by the sound of it, they were trying to coax him into the water with them. He looked back towards the road, his bike a shadowy hulk on the street, and then again at the speaker. He said something too low for me to hear, and when they returned to that sweet honey sound, he walked into the water, and I heard him splashing as he dove. I ran from my room and went softly down the stairs. I was worried about him. He was a strong swimmer, but the waters at night were likely dangerous. I came out onto the beach, whispering his name so as not to wake my folks up. I went to the edge of the water and scanned the dark ocean for him, but he was nowhere to be found. He had been there only a moment before, hadn't he? I spent a few minutes searching for him before finally heading inside, thinking maybe I'd been dreaming or something. That was when I heard the voice. "Hello, handsome." I turned back to the water. I'd heard a feminine voice speak, heard it plain as day, but all I could see was the black waves as they churned endlessly. It was dark out there, too dark, and I didn't think that anything could exist out there in that blackness. "Not leaving already, are you?" the voice asked again. It was closer now, and when I looked, I saw a silver-haired girl sitting on the shoreline. It was the same one as before. She was dressed in a green dress, the color of seaweed. Her hair was long and silver and hung wild around her, shimmering wetly in the moonlight. Her skin was like porcelain, so white and flawless, and her face looked like a carved mask made of flesh. Her hands were on her knees, and when she turned, she smiled at me with the most beautiful set of perfect white teeth. She was breathtaking, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and as she tugged at my legs, trying to get me to sit, I did. "What brings you here so late?" she asked in her whispery voice. I thought my friend was here." "No one here but me and you." Her silvery hair danced in the moonlight as she shook her head. "I saw you the first night I moved in here," I said, not knowing why. She nodded. I wanted to say hello. Now it seems I have. I don't know how long I sat there, but it was the best night of my life. We talked for hours about nothing at all. She absorbed every word I said, and I basked in her ephemeral beauty. She was a goddess, her skin lacking blemishes or faults, her hair a perfect sheet of silver. We talked until the sun came up, and I remember her looking at it and giving it a little hiss. Come see me tonight, handsome, she said sweetly. Wait, where are you going? Home. I'll be back tonight. Then she kissed me, and my whole world trembled on the edge of breaking as her lips pressed against mine. When I came back to myself, I was lying on the beach. Matt's parents showed up the next day around lunch. Matt had apparently been missing since last night. They were worried about him because he hadn't been acting like himself lately. He hadn't been eating well, his sleep had been fitful, and they had often woken up to find him gone at night. Matt's father had found him on our beach many times, curled up in the sand, and they had hoped they'd find him here today. My parents said they hadn't seen him, and I said the same. It wasn't a lie. I hadn't seen him after all. I'd seen the girl, the most beautiful moonchild, but any thoughts of my friend had fled my mind after that. They left to see the sheriff, and Mom bemoaned the luck. She asked if I was sure I hadn't seen him last night, and I said that I hadn't. After lunch, I went up and took a nap. I wanted to be fresh for her tonight. I met with her every night that week. I came up after sundown to find her sprawling on the beach waiting for me. We talked for hours, locked in each other's eyes. Her face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and she seemed to hang on my every word. Thinking back, I don't think she spoke much at all. She wanted to hear about my life, my friends, my hobbies, books I'd read, and anything else that mattered to me. She always left at sunrise, kissing me and leaving me dazed and confused. In town, Matt's disappearance was big news. The sheriff had talked to us a few times, wondering if any of us had seen him. The state police were searching everywhere. Every friend he'd ever had, anyone who could have any contact with him, and every place he might have been was searched and searched again. Knowing him to be a swimmer, they were scuba divers combing the ocean, but their hopes were low of finding him if he'd gone into the water. I was in a daze. My waking thoughts were of the girl, the lovely girl, and when I would see her again. Kyle tried to get me to come looking for Matt with them, but I was always too tired. Mom wanted to take me school shopping, but school just didn't interest me. I was in love, I was in lust, and I wanted nothing but my porcelain goddess forever. My haze held until one day when they found Matt. Kyle came slamming into my room, rousing me from sleep and saying we had to go. What? Kyle, it's too early. I want to sleep. It's 12:30, dude. Get up and come with me, now. He threw clothes at me as I groggily got out of bed. What's your damage, man? Why the sudden rush? We found him. My blood ran cold. You found Matt? What's left of him? Stewart's got the sheriff, and Roger's staying with the body. I need you to come say your goodbyes before the media circus hits. If you even want to say goodbye. I put my shirt on, glaring at him owlishly. What's that supposed to mean? Kyle glared at me. You're acting just like him before he disappeared. You don't want to hang out. You don't even want to help us look for him. So I'm assuming that you already knew he was missing. I don't like what you're insinuating, I said, starting to get angry. You seemed like a good guy when you first moved to town, but now I'm not so sure. You know something. Maybe not all of it, but you know something. Now either come with me or don't, but either way, it's the last time you're ever going to see him. It's also the last time I want to see you. I got dressed and followed him. Matt, it turned out, had washed up on the beach about 5 miles from my house. Well, what was left of him had washed up. His arms and legs were picked over stumps. His eyes and nose were gone, ditto for his lips and ears. If he hadn't still been wearing the t-shirt that Roger had given him for his birthday a year before, no one would have known it was him. He was a torso, picked over from head to toe. When we got there, Stewart and Roger were nearby, both of them crying. The sheriff had shunted the two boys away, and as we approached, he raised a hand to stop us. No closer, boys. I appreciate you finding the body, but I need you to stand back. Kyle told the sheriff how they had found the body while riding along the road. We were going to the corner store when we saw him. We thought he was a dolphin that had been washed up until we saw the t-shirt. That's when we came to get you. The ambulance came and took the body away. I remember looking at him under that white sheet and still being able to see his eyeless face. I realized I'd been living in a cloud the whole time. I needed to find out what had happened that night, and only one person knew for sure. After dark, I went to find her. She lay waiting for me, the same as always, but when I didn't sit, she seemed worried. "What's wrong, handsome? You seem upset." I took a deep breath. "What happened to Matt the night we met?" "Who?" she asked, but her voice didn't seem right. "My friend, Matt. I think you'd been talking to him just like this before he died. I think he went into the water after you that night, and now his body is sitting in the morgue, half eaten." I took a step back from her. "Handsome, I don't know who this person is. Why don't you come sit with me? You can tell me all about them." She patted the sand, and for a moment I saw a hand the color of algae. I saw a hand with webbed fingers. She must have noticed, because the hand was normal again just that fast. I took another step back. "Why did you save him all those years ago? Why did you save him from drowning if you were just going to kill him?" She looked down, her hair making a sheet in front of her face. "He wasn't ready yet." That sent a shiver through me. Ready? Ready for what? When she looked back up, her face had changed. Her eyes were like onyx stones. Her nose had become a snake's slit. Her teeth were rows of sewing needles, and her grin looked ready to split her full rotten lips. The dress wasn't a dress. It was her shimmering scales, and as she moved, I could see a tail like a carp's attached to her. Her whispery voice was now like a hook dragged across a rock. "We needed his seed. Our men are gone. There's no one to hunt for us. We must make some more. We have to create the next generation." My feet were moving backwards now. "You killed him for his... We needed his seed. We needed his meat. Once we were done, we gave him back," she said, her teeth fixed in a lazy grin. "I don't want to see you anymore," I said. "You're not the person I thought you were." I was 12 feet away, but I heard her final words on the subject. "You can't turn from me, boy. I swim in your veins now. You can't deny me any more than he could." She was right. Even as I walked away, wanting to run, I felt my feet trying to go back to her. I had to make myself go inside. I had to make myself go into my room. I had to make myself close the curtains and try to resist the urge to go back to the beach. Writing this helped, but I can't stop thinking about her, even with my mind so distracted. She's never a monster in my memories. When I think of her, she's always the porcelain moonchild I met on the beach. She's always the sweet girl whose lips were sweeter still. She's always the subject of my infatuation. I peeked out my window several times. She's out on the rock, sitting on the throne, singing to me. Her song is for me alone, and I know that I will go to her despite my best efforts. Even now, I feel like a swim. Even now, I feel myself wanting to swim to her. Even now, I feel myself wanting to see what she has to show me in the deeps. I need to tell someone about this, mostly to get it off my chest, but also because, screwed up as the situation is, it's one of the best stories I've ever heard. I attend a large university in Arizona. I won't say which, but my friends and I were sharing a bottle of Jack the other night, and we started sharing stories. Somehow, we got on the subject of spooky stories, and it appeared that several of us had a strange occurrence to talk about. Gabriel told us about a weird apartment that he and his mother had lived in when they were in West Virginia. Apparently his mother had woken up screaming one night after a dark figure had appeared over her bed. He had come in and found it melting away into nothing, and the two of them had moved out shortly thereafter. John told us about a weird deer he'd seen on a hunting trip, and I told them about a sound I'd heard outside my parents' house in Montana throughout my childhood. One of Dad's friends, he was a zoologist or something, said it didn't sound like any animal he was familiar with. Dad jokingly asked him if it was a Bigfoot or something. He never really quite denied it. He got spooky quiet and just said he wouldn't be caught out dead in the woods, especially not after dark. We never went camping out there anymore, but we certainly never went past the property line either after dark. Passed the bottle to Samuel, and for once, he actually took a sip. Samuel, or Sam for short, had been living in the dorm since before we'd arrived at university. He was in his third year and was studying engineering as he worked towards a bachelor's degree. He had told us several stories about growing up in a small town in Mexico and how his uncle was thanks to his current status as a student. His uncle was a professor of Spanish studies and antiquities, and he had offered to help his nephew get a student visa so he could do more than drink shitty beer in the local bar and do manual labor his whole life. I opened up saying that it was weird to see Samuel drink, but I don't think you understand how strange it was. Samuel was our permanent designated driver because in the 2 years that we'd known him, I had never so much as seen him touch a bottle of alcohol, unless it was to throw it away or take it from us when we'd had enough. He took a moment to collect his thoughts before saying in a hollow voice, "I told you all I grew up in Mexico, right?" We all nodded. He continued, "Well, I grew up in this rural little town right outside of Hermosillo. It wasn't large, maybe 8,000 people in the whole town, and most of our work came from the processing plant or from the farms that operated around the small town. My mother and I lived there with my abuelo and my abuela. My uncle was living in America and sending money back when he could. My abuelo was a horse breeder, something my family had practiced for generations, and he would work for the stockman for one of the larger ranches in the area. We weren't quite as well off as the rancher, but we were doing okay. Wasn't a bad life. It was hard, but not without its pleasures. When I was in high school, my friends and I would go to parties held at the local farms. The rancher's son, Santiago, and I had been friends since we were young, and we palled around with some of the ranch hand sons, Juan, Christopher, and Mateo. We were good friends, probably the best friends I've ever had, but one night we found something that none of us quite believed in. We had all grown up with stories about La Llorona or El Cibon, but my mother always loved to use a certain legend to scare me. La Lechuza was a witch who turned herself into some sort of owl demon after her death. She was said to roam the lands, hunting for drunks or just children out after dark. She would make noises in the night to trick you into opening your window so she could steal your eyes. She would pretend to be a baby to lure you into the woods. She would create thunderstorms and other nasty things and would come to get naughty children if they acted out. La Lechuza was used a lot in my house to get me to do things like chores or homework that I really didn't want to do. By the time I was a teenager, though, I was kind of done with my mom's scary stories about owl ladies. I was much more interested in drinking with my friends and meeting girls. I was 16 when she caught me on my way out the door. "I know where you're going off to. I beg you, do not go out there and drink with your friends." I brushed her off, saying I was of age, and if I wanted to go hang out with my friends, then I would. And if La Lechuza would happen across you and your group? I scoffed, telling her that her stories didn't scare me anymore. "That story is what killed your father," she started to say, but I cut her off. "Dad had died in a drunk driving accident before I was born. He had driven off the road and hit a tree, his car erupting into a ball of flame, and that's why we had nothing to bury." But Mom had insisted that it had been La Lechuza who had driven him off the road. This had made me even scarier of the creature when I was a kid, but now it made me mad that she would use my father's death like this. I left without another word, climbing into Santiago's car as it pulled away from my house for the last time. She was standing in the road crying as we drove off. That image will be scarred into my brain until the day I die. We were out late. I couldn't tell you much about the party, just that it was in someone's barn. The beer was hot, the women were lukewarm, and the music was subpar at best. I drank too much, trying to get the fight with my mom out of my head, and by the time we called it a night, I was well and truly drunk. We climbed into Santiago's car, all of us laughing and tipsy. We started out, Santiago managing to keep it on the road as we whooped and hollered in the back seat. He was laughing along with us, turning the music up on the radio, but when he swerved suddenly, we all screamed like banshees. He hauled us back on the road, Mateo opening the window to vomit, and I leaned up as I asked him what was wrong. He looked pale, all the tipsy scared out of him as he stammered, "I thought there was an old lady in the road, but when she turned, her body looked wrong." I said how weird it was to see someone so old out this late, but suddenly I yelled for him to look. Something was in the road, and if it was what he had seen before, he had been absolutely right. It was hunched over, a long cloak on its shoulders, and it looked deformed. It turned to look at the car as it barreled forward, and I could see piercing red eyes that bore into my soul. I saw it all in the space of 5 seconds, maybe, but those eyes will stay with me forever. Santiago never had a chance to do anything. He just plowed right into her, doing 55. The car suddenly stopped dead, and I came to about a minute later. I had boffed my head pretty good on the seat, but one look at Santiago told me I had gotten off lucky. He had slammed into the windshield, breaking his neck and turning his skull into a rotten gourd. The others seemed to be okay, but the car was smoking, and we climbed out as we assessed the damage. The whole front end was smashed in like we'd hit a tree or a big rock, but nothing was in the road to be hit. I remembered the old lady and moved off to check the ditches, thinking maybe we had knocked her off the road. The others just milled about, not sure what to do, and that's when it happened. The moon was full that night, or I may very well have missed it. A shadow passed over me, a thing with a wingspan like a condor, and I looked up just in time to see it drop onto my friends as they stood huddled around the car. It had landed on Juan, breaking his back and riding him to the ground. He screamed, watery and miserable. He wouldn't scream for long, though. The bird dropped its head and began to feed on him, its beak plunging and diving as the other two backed away in horror. When it looked up, face dripping blood and owl eyes glaring at me, I ran. I don't know if the other two ran at the time, but I felt like a mouse who'd seen an owl. I ran, still drunk and weaving, and the houses swam up in my peripherals. I could still hear that wet, crunching sound as the creature fed, and I stumbled as my feet hit a root. I kept running, kept moving, kept showing my heels as the houses wobbled like an oil painting all around me. I just kept running, knowing that my house couldn't be far, not noticing the lack of night sounds until it was too late. When that unearthly screech split the night, I panicked and turned a corner at random. When my foot hit a pothole, I thought for sure I was going to die. My world suddenly exploded with light, and I stumbled back on my hands and butt as a bright something nearly blinded me. I turned, putting my back to those blinding lights, and saw a horror as it descended. The headlights spotlighted the owl thing, and as it swooped down on me, I figured this was the end. I closed my eyes and put my hands up across my face, preparing for the end. That's when I heard my mom yelling at the thing. She came out of the car, shouting curses and brandishing a cross on a long silver chain. The owl monster flapped its wings, changing its course and taking off again. It screeched loudly, flapping those wings angrily as it flew away. My mother helped me into the car then, but I must have passed out, because I woke up in my bed the next morning. I would have believed it was a dream if Mom hadn't told me all about it as we sat at the breakfast table. She had made food, and there was a pot of coffee there as well. As I ate, she told me all of it. How the creature had killed my dad one night as he drove home drunk, how Santiago and Juan had been found dead that morning, how my other friends had never arrived home that night. She spelled it out for me and told me how lucky I was to be alive. She said I had been given a chance and that it was up to me to figure out how to use it. She wasn't happy with my answer after I'd thought about it for a few days, but I think she understood. I still went to those parties, but I never drank again. Instead, I helped people get home safely. I never saw that creature again, but there were nights that I imagined I could feel its hateful stare. I was taking its prey from it, stealing its food, and it never quite forgave me for that. Not a day goes by that I don't think about that night and my friends who died. We sat there, drinking as we listened to his story, a cold chill flowing through us as we took it all in. I'd say this was the end, but that wouldn't do him or his story justice. 3 weeks ago, Samuel came to me in tears and told me that his mother was going to die. I sat him down. He was shaking like a leaf, and asked him how he could possibly know that. Before that, I hadn't seen him in class in a few days, and he looked tired and rattled. I dreamed I was in my mother's house, the one she has on my grandparents' property, and I heard her crying. I walked into the living room, and she was sitting at the kitchen table. I walked up behind her, putting a hand on her shoulder, and asked her what was wrong. She grabbed my arm, and her hand had become a claw. Her head turned around and she screeched at me through that owl beak. Her face had become that of the owl witch, and just before I woke up, she screamed my mother's name. I asked him what that meant, and he said, "Some people say that seeing her in a dream means that someone you love will die. She screamed my mother's name. I can't ignore that." 3 days later, he told me he was returning home for his mother's funeral. They found her in her room. She'd had a heart attack. I need to go home and say goodbye. Will you watch my plants while I'm away? I told him I would, but I think he knew he wasn't coming back. A week ago, I asked his uncle if there was any news. His uncle only sighed and told me that his nephew was missing. My mother tells me that he went to the house he and his mother had shared. No one has seen him since. We don't know where he is, but if you're still watering his plants, I'll pick them up this afternoon. Hopefully, I can give them to him when he comes back. I don't know what became of Sam, but I pray that the owl witch, Lechuza, did not get him. Hey there, folks. Dr. Plague here. Hope you're having a good night. This is just me popping in at the beginning to let you know that the nature of this video is a little triggering to certain people. It involves animal violence, animal cruelty, and things of a sexual nature, such as fetishes and adult activities. If that's something that you're not wanting to hear, then, go find another video. Maybe one of my other videos. I don't know. Can't tell you how to live your life. But if this is right up your alley, then please enjoy. I was speechless when she sent me the message. Even her text looked sexy in the pink curly writing she used. It was short and sweet and to the point, but it still filled my chest with a tightness that wouldn't go away. At the time, it was a dream come true. Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late. I couldn't believe this was happening. Tonight, I would meet with Lady Dragora. I guess you could say I have a slight problem with weird fetishes. I discovered pornography when I was young, like most people I know. I was 12, I was horny, and someone I knew said I could find boobs online if I looked. I dived headfirst into a well I don't think I really understood the depths of. It started with generic stuff, naked photos, short clips from films, and led to my current level of kink. I started slow, it was the 90s after all, and internet connections were not what they would become. I have waited all day for a single picture to load, only to be disappointed when the phone rang and everything was lost. Most of my early burgeonings were done in chat rooms, in the steamy squares of private messages. With both of my parents away at work, I was on the computer every day after school. I didn't discover my proclivity for vor until I was in college. When you've been cruising the web for as long as I have, you eventually find yourself into some offbeat stuff. You can't experience that much depravity and not be changed fundamentally, and I was no different. I had recently grown bored with my selection of smut and went looking for something different. When I found vor, though, I knew I had found something special. Vor, if you're unfamiliar, is a fetish that centers around eating or being eaten by something. In the community of niche communities, vor is pretty niche. I belong to several online communities where we discuss the acts and the aftermath and trade images online. But I only know a few people in my area who are into it. We meet up once a week to have coffee and gush over our favorite vor videos and whatnot, and gush over our local legend, Lady Dragora. Lady Dragora was a legend in the vor scene. She had a subreddit devoted to her videos, a Snapchat full of fans who hungered for her next performance, and a legion of fans willing to pay exorbitant fees for her live shows and recordings. She wouldn't tell people her age, but most of us guess she's in her 30s. She has this long, dark hair that falls in straight waves of ebony silk, and her eyes hold the slight hint of some Asian parentage, maybe. She's beautiful, she's exotic, and she was a total sadist. Lady Dragora made the kind of videos that were illegal everywhere. She made the sort of videos that came with a price tag payable in cryptocurrency. I had seen other so-called vor videos before her, but many were obviously fake, obviously staged, or obviously CGI. People would eat mice only to have a jump cut before they started chewing. They would dangle CGI mice over their gaping maws. They would pretend to eat things or eat things they were pretending were alive. And after a while, it just becomes a little old. Her videos were something different. The first video I ever saw involved her eating a rat the size of her hand. The video opened on a terrarium full of squirming rats, not mice, sewer rats. And as she approached the tank, they all began to go wild. They ran over the top of each other, squealing in pure terror. It was as though they sensed a bigger predator coming and wanted to be sure her eyes didn't fall on them. She was dressed in what would become her signature black bodice, garters, black choker, black elbow-length gloves, and long leather knee-high boots. Some videos seemed to require music laid over the top, but not hers. When she reached inside the tank, you could hear the rats screaming and flailing inside as they tried desperately to avoid her hand. She selected one of them and pulled him out with a gloved hand. The rat squirmed and kicked, visibly distressed by her, but she paid him no mind. She replaced the lid and walked away from the tank with the screaming rodent. Their cries were high-pitched, almost pig-like, and you could hear them off camera in low waves. The video cut to her, holding the rat up to the camera, still squirming and biting as it struggled to free itself. She held it too tight in her clenched fist, and its fur seemed to boil around that fist like water overflowing a glass. I expected a jump cut when she opened her mouth and leaned over the rat's head. It screamed pitifully as her teeth encircled its writhing head. He bit at her, lashing out with those sharp teeth, but if she felt it, she seemed not to notice. It spasmed as her teeth began to close around its head, and I watched, thinking to myself that the jump cut would be any minute now. This will be when the video jags and her teeth will close around a plastic rat. She'll be just another pretender, just another charlatan, just another... The blood flowed out as the rat made its final scream. Her teeth sank into it and tore at its skin. When she came away, she was chewing, and the rat's body twitched in her hand as she ate. The twitching stopped before she went back for another bite, but the blood made a macabre sort of fountain as it ran down her gloved fingers and pattered to the floor. She ate the whole rat, one bite at a time, bones and all, and as the tail disappeared down her throat, I was hooked. I'd probably watched about a dozen of her videos before I dared to show anyone. Sometimes she bit, which was hot, but sometimes it seemed that she would just swallow whatever she was eating whole. She'd worry it down with very little difficulty, her throat bulging as whatever it was slid down, and to me, that was more erotic than the chewing. It wasn't just rodents either. Eels, mice, more rats, chicks, they all went down her throat, while my friends and I paid $79.99 a video. 2 months ago, she put a small camera on a mouse and swallowed it whole while videoing its descent into her stomach. The camera must have cost her quite a bit. Between the size of the camera, the night vision interface, and the video's price, I knew it wouldn't be something we could expect often. The footage changed the way I'd viewed my fetish. Watching something struggle in her stomach, watching its final moments, was far more intimate than watching her swallow it whole. I told her as much on the comment section of her website. I spilled my guts to her, hoping to impress her, and somehow it worked. I wish I knew what would come of that stupid comment. I was shocked when she responded. I'd been sitting at the coffee bar with the other members of our group, Doug and Matt and David. We were all discussing the latest video by Lady D when my phone chirped loudly. I looked down to check it and saw a banner informing me that Lady Dragora has responded to your comment. I almost spewed hot coffee on Doug before opening the message and reading what she'd written. The guys leaned in close, wondering what I'd seen to garner such attention, and when he saw the sender, he too almost spit coffee in surprise. I opened her message, and it said 8 short words. How profound. I would love to chat sometime. Dave whistled through his teeth. "Wow, she rarely talks to fans. You're in, man." And so I was. As they sat crowded around me, I answered her, and she immediately began our strange correspondence. I didn't question it at the time, but the speed with which she picked up our conversations should have triggered a red flag or two. It was as though she were just waiting for me to respond, waiting for her prey to wander into her field of influence so she could snap the trap shut and watch it squirm. For 3 months, we chatted almost every day. We talked about everything: music, food, the usual getting to know you stuff. We eventually made it to topics that were a little more personal. It turned out that she held some strange beliefs about life force, believed that consuming the flesh of living creatures would give her their life force and extend her own life somehow. I asked her if she'd ever eaten human flesh, but she just joked that maybe I'd find out someday and danced around the subject. The more I talked to her, the more I became certain that she had traveled much and knew things that I could only guess at. She spoke about distant places and strange customs. If I hadn't been so enchanted by the attention of a celebrity, I might have seen the numerous red flags she was putting up. She talked a lot about places you didn't see on the Travel Channel, sites that didn't have names you could scrawl across a map, locations both ancient and remote. A month ago, she asked me if I would roleplay with her. I agreed, of course, because I was hooked on her attention. Even in my haze of glamour, though, I knew there was something a little off. Her persona was that of a large reptile, and mine was always of some prey animal fit only for ingestion. She would describe my end, my passing between large and ancient lips, and my slow descent towards the transition into nutrition. I would describe my struggles, my vain attempts at escape, but she would always catch me and describe in loving detail my demise at her jaws. I loved it. After all, this was my thing, and I often walked away from our sessions with a bounce in my step. People probably had a hard time understanding how someone achieved satisfaction at the idea of being devoured, but to me, it was no different than any other obsession. We would roleplay twice a week, her scenarios and story threads becoming darker as they went, and before long, she wasn't just swallowing me whole, but tearing into me and getting a little violent. I was less on board with these instances. Imagining myself going through these pains were never my thing, but she always smoothed it over with personalized videos or custom works just for me. She made me feel special, made me feel accepted, and that's what made it easy to draw me in. This was also when I was approached by Justin. His screen name was Furrylocks on the board in question. Until he messaged me, I'd never even heard of him, though it seemed we moved in similar circles. My only correspondence with him was a message left in my inbox one morning. It was hastily written, full of spelling errors, and intrigued me to no end. I read it twice before class, and when I showed it to my friends in the Vor group, they brushed it off as a jealous fan. His message was not long, but it did make me question some rumors I'd heard on some of the other boards. It read, "You don't know me. My name is Justin. I understand that you've become close with an internet personality known as Lady Dragora. I don't know how much you know about her, but she may or may not be 100% what she seems to be. I had a friend whom I'd known since grade school. He caught the attention of the lady, and it was the happiest I'd ever seen him. Their relationship was brief, a month or two. Then one night, he told me she'd invited him to her hotel room. I didn't think anything of it until he didn't respond to my calls or texts for 2 days. He's been missing for 3 months now, and your new lady friend has either blocked me or refused to respond to any of my messages. I'm not trying to turn you away from your current relationship, whatever that might entail. I'm simply trying to warn you to be on your guard." I was hesitant to respond. It seemed better to just ignore him, but after a particularly grisly RP session a week later, I decided to message him and get some information. I was still very much under her spell, but some of our conversations had made me wary. After all, she was still a stranger on the internet. Growing up in an age of stranger danger, I was very wary of people online pretending to be someone they weren't, a collection of online videos or not. However, my message was never opened, never read, and when the invitation to her hotel room came across my box, I decided to put my fears aside and go for it. That's how I came to be in her hotel room at 11 p.m. She sent me the text around 6 in the afternoon. "Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late," was all it said, but it was enough to get my blood running hot. The Hotel Aries was not a huge hotel, but it was one of the largest in this part of Chicago. The borough of Chicago was an hour from campus, but I drove the distance gladly. If she told me to drive to New York that night, I'd have done it. And with the invitation being so close to home, I decided I would be a fool not to accept. I told my friends from the coffee shop where I was going. They told me to take some video and let me know when they got home. I set out for the hotel in high spirits, my mind flooded with possibilities. I had arrived early, 2 hours early, hoping that maybe we could have a meal before whatever was going to happen tonight. I inquired at the front desk, and the man behind the counter gave me a knowing little smile as he slid the key card across to me. "She's gone out for a little while, but she mentioned that she likely had a guest coming tonight." "Have fun," he said. I started up to the elevator, wondering how often he'd had to do this for her. How often did she have guests? I took the elevator up to the penthouse and found a lavish one-bedroom suite decked out in rich fabrics and expensive furniture. I recognized it as the backdrop for many of her videos and found a camera already set up in the corner. She had left me a note, too, telling me to make myself at home and that she would be back at 11. The waiting was nerve-wracking. I took a seat on her luxurious couch and just sat there. My mind raced, going over possibilities and scenarios and making me a nervous wreck of anticipation. When the elevator finally came up to the penthouse, I felt a surge of excitement that my patience might finally pay off. She was framed in the elevator door as they opened, and it was the first time I'd ever met her in person. She wore a long tan coat and the same black boots she'd worn in her videos. Her shiny black hair was pulled back into its accustomed tail. As she stepped off the elevator, she let her coat puddle on the floor, and I could see her familiar black corset. She smiled when she saw me, and as I rose to greet her, she held out a finger, indicating me to stand and be quiet. She circled me, drinking me in with her eyes. The hungry way she looked at me made me both incredibly aroused and extremely uncomfortable. She was looking at me the way I look at a particularly tasty meal. Though this was certainly what I wanted, I had never seen someone look at another person that way before. She didn't say a word, just walked over to the camera and pointed it towards me. As she turned, I saw the red light was on. Looked like I was going to be in one of her movies tonight. "Don't worry," she said, her voice hinting at foreign places and exotic locales. "This is just for me. I'd never post anything online without your consent." I smiled at her and started to disrobe, but she stopped me with a delicate finger. "Leave them on. I like to handle the clothes myself." She stepped away from me then, eyes smoldering as she held me in her gaze, and then something happened. If you've ever seen one of those old werewolf movies, the kind where their whole body shifts in a rapid and sudden transformation, then you may have some idea of what I saw. If not, I'll try to explain it as best I can. Her body seemed to ripple, her whole form shuddering like an image in a pond, and suddenly there was something else in front of me. Her body was a long mass of jade scales towering 12 feet high. As it reached its full height, it had to crouch to avoid hitting the ceiling, but this seemed to suit it just fine. It crouched to eye level, its spade-shaped head hovering inches from my body, and I realized that its eyes, those vast and hovering pools of death, were the same as hers. I was trapped by those eyes, like a bird before the snake, and when she struck, I never even had a chance to run. If you're reading this, then your next question must be, how am I even writing this? Being eaten is normally where the story like this would end, but unfortunately for me, it's not. Lady Dragora, that queen serpent of myth, has been dining on humans for a very long time, it would seem. She neither bit nor tore me. Instead, she struck with a precision born of years of practice and swallowed me whole with little effort. As I slid down her throat, I felt the slimy walls caress me and the suffocating darkness inviting me towards terror. She had let me keep my phone, however, and as I wiggled to get it, I could feel a new sensation coursing through the giant muscles that were her body, the squirming desire for more. That's when I realized what she wanted. She doesn't want a quick meal. She doesn't want a satisfying feed. She wants a terrified body to thrash and scream as her body does when it does best. She wants my last few hours to be her pleasure. So I've been sitting as still as I can for the last hour of my life, writing this message to the outside world. I've sent a copy to my friends at the coffee shop, a copy to the Chicago police, and I've posted a copy here, hoping that someone will read this and take it seriously. I now know what happened to Justin's missing friend, what likely happened to Justin himself, and the fate that awaits me at the end of my life. I want my death to be the last, though, so if you read this and you see her, don't fall for her games. Don't let yourself be another meal for... Good afternoon, beautiful. Paul had rushed home from work, just like he had every day for the past 2 weeks. Reagan and Frank had said something about drinks after their shift, but he'd barely heard them. He had only one thought on his mind, the same thing he had for the past 2 weeks. Lisa. Man, you're falling way too hard for this gal, Frank had told him, as he made the usual excuses. You don't even know what she looks like, he added, before Paul could make his escape. Sure I do, Paul protested, and turned to go. 5'5", 100 pounds even, long brown hair, B-cup with mossy green eyes, and a love of classical music. Reagan had scoffed. I didn't ask what her profile said, man. He'd rolled his eyes and took another puff off his cigarette. I asked if you knew what she looked like. She looks like an angel, boys, and this angel's waiting for me. And with that, he'd been off. He'd rushed home through 2 blocks of busy Chicago streets to sink happily into his chair and find her online. Lisa. Just saying her name made his heart race. Lisa had found him, actually sought him out after reading something he'd posted on a forum. They started talking, and from day one it seemed like they had known each other for years. It seemed as though years themselves had passed by while she was with him, though it could have been seconds. Nothing else mattered when she was online. He went to bed later and later each night, not wanting to stop talking to her for a second. And strangely, she didn't seem to mind at all. She was as smitten with him as he was with her. A perfect match. Hi, Polly. Rough day today? She was so cute. After 2 weeks, Paul had been hard-pressed to find anything he didn't like about her. The way she called him Polly, the way she always asked about his day, the way she always remembered important things he'd told her, even when he couldn't, the way her words seemed to smile at him. She was something he'd always wanted. She was everything he'd always wanted. Much better now that you're here, Lisa, he said. Aw, you're such a teaser. I've been waiting for my Polly all day, and now I finally have you. You sure do. I'm all yours, baby. The scream of the alarm clock brought him back to reality. It had been such a good night last night, but now it was time for another fun-filled day of work. Last night, just thinking about it made his heart race again. They had talked till almost dawn. He'd only stopped when his eyes had gotten heavy and finally betrayed him. She was a technician, his Lisa. She just kept on talking, kept on laughing, only wanting more of him. He felt his face redden as he lurched into the kitchen and turned on the tiny television by the counter. A man in a gray suit was pointing at a weather map and talking about the weekend weather as Paul poured milk on his sugar flakes. The man was finishing up his report as Paul leaned against the counter, and the camera turned back to a bubbly young woman and a middle-aged man dressed in a similar gray suit. For those of you just joining us, our top story remains the murder of the mayor and his wife early this morning. Police responded to screams in the early morning hours and found both victims stabbed multiple times. Though the murder weapon like much else about the murder, has not been released. Police have said that they have a suspect in custody. Pretty unsettling stuff, wouldn't you say, Megan? The bubbly brown-haired woman on his side nodded fervently. Unsettling indeed. The murders come just a week after the mayor's inflammatory remarks concerning the rights of ID workers after their second week on strike. He was a firm opponent of artificial rights in... But Paul turned it off and put the empty bowl in the sink. The news was so depressing these days. People being murdered in their own homes. These damn ID workers thinking they could demand rights all of a sudden. And to top it all off, there was so much anti-ID sentiment that the city was becoming a melting pot of chaos. At least I've got my Lisa. The struggles of the world don't mean much as long as I've got her, he said to himself. Paul beamed all the way to work. He passed other people on the street, making their way to work, home, or wherever they were going this time of morning. He didn't care. He was on cloud 9. He just really didn't have time to pay any more attention. He had a checklist of things he needed to get done today, and as he rounded 8th Street and proceeded to Wellington, he ticked them off. He had a meeting at 1 to prepare for. He'd be introducing his product findings for the quarter. Then at 3, he had his next quarter numbers to send to the boss. Then it was home to spend his evenings in the virtual embrace of Lisa. Somewhere along the way, he'd see his friends, have lunch, pick up dinner, but that too seemed secondary next to the idea of talking to Lisa. He sighed, wishing it were 3 already. There was a big crowd outside when he arrived, and he could see police tape across the doors. Mr. Marshall, the office director, was talking loudly to a uniformed man, and several officers were carrying out computers, taking fingerprints, removing fragments from the door. Paul slid in next to Frank. As usual, Reagan was late, but it didn't look like anyone would be getting any work done today. What happened? Paul asked in a hushed voice, as one of the officers brought a filing cabinet out on a hand dolly. Seems there was a break-in last night, said Frank, making no effort to keep his voice low. A break-in? What could anybody possibly want in our office? I mean, we sell computer chips. We don't even keep them on site. No clue, said Frank, as Reagan slid in next to him. A blonde woman, Paul thought her name was Frances, leaned back and said in a low voice, Agnes was the first person in this morning. She said the front door to the Human Resource Office was destroyed, and 2 filing cabinets were wrenched open. She thinks they were after files or something. Paul's brow creased as he contemplated the mystery that had suddenly and possibly led to him not having to work today. He smiled a little to himself, thinking that sounded like a pretty good day to him. And so they gave us the rest of the day off, and tomorrow, with pay. That's wonderful, Polly. I'm glad you got some time to rest after such a stressful week. They had been talking all morning. As lunchtime came around, Paul's stomach made a low, pitiful rumble. He ignored it, though. This was right where he wanted to be. As it rumbled again, though, an idea began to form. Stomach's trying to tear me away from you, he commented offhandedly. Oh, do you need to get some lunch? Well, actually, I was hoping you'd maybe meet me somewhere. Maybe Gabriel's on 7th? They make a mean hoagie. The message hung for a couple of minutes. My treat, he added, not liking the silence. I don't know, Polly, she finally said after a few more seconds of silence. Lisa, if I'm being honest, I like you, and I would like to take our relationship to a more 3-dimensional level. Won't you please consider a date with me? She hesitated before responding. I'm sorry, Polly. I'm just not ready yet. There are things about myself I'm not quite comfortable with. I can't face you. Not yet, Polly. Just be patient with me. I'm new to this kind of thing. Polly sighed. You're a girl worth waiting for, Lisa. A girl as pretty as you can take their time. Oh, Polly, you always know just what to say to make a girl smile. So, Paul, how's that lady of yours? Paul kept his eyes on his computer. This document had to be finished before he left at 3. The break-in had been a week ago, but the office was still trying to get back into their usual routine. Fine, he said, returning to typing. So, when's the first date? Frank asked as he stirred lazily at his coffee. He'd been getting pretty nosy after the break-in, and his questions were becoming suffocating. Between Frank and Reagan, he was lucky to get a moment's peace. They were continuously asking him out for drinks or to stop by unannounced to hang out, which seemed to entail keeping him off the computer and squarely in the real world. He was already irritable from a lack of sleep, and he really didn't need this today. He couldn't say why, but he was sure someone had been on the fire escape last night. He'd woken up several times to a shadow cast across his bed and the foreboding feeling of being watched. The shadow would move as soon as he tried to see what it was, until finally he'd slept facing away from the window and hadn't been bothered for the rest of the night. His conversations with Lisa had gotten more involved as well, to his great joy. The intimacy of the questions often made him blush, and she seemed ravenous to know everything about him. The minutest details seemed to only stoke the flames of her curiosity, and Paul felt giddy as she shared more of herself with him. Meetings, however, remained a shaky bit of ground. "We haven't set one," he said curtly, as he continued about his business. It was getting late, nearly 3, and his work wasn't done. He'd have to stay late to finish, and that was precious time that he couldn't spend with Lisa. "Geez, Paul, you've been talking to this gal for a month now, and you still haven't met her?" "I don't recall asking your opinion on my relationship, Frank," Paul snapped, and instantly felt ashamed. "Sorry, I'm just tired. I didn't sleep well last night again." He didn't dare tell anyone about the shadow. People would think he was nuts. "It's fine, buddy. I can tell you're hurting for sleep. I just don't want to see you get burned, you know? These gals online find a nice guy like you, and they bleed him dry, Paul. Can we change the subject?" Paul begged. Frank nodded, taking the hint. "You hear about the disappearance of that scientist from the facility?" Of course Paul had. It was all over the news. They think now that the ID might have been involved. You know, our company had something to do with them in the first place, so maybe they think we need a little revenge on our own. Paul was about to say this really wasn't a topic for work when the clock struck 3, and Paul happily filed his report away and turned his computer off for the night. "Another fun-filled evening with your make-believe lady?" Frank asked, and Paul pulled his windbreaker on over his work shirt. "Lisa's a real person, Frank. I wish you could see her the way I do sometimes. Then maybe you'd stop with all these stupid questions." Frank scoffed. "Make sure you get some sleep, buddy. You look kind of beat." "Thanks, Mom," Paul said, as he threw his messenger bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. As he neared his apartment, Paul saw an unfamiliar woman near the mailboxes. She was bent at the knee, reading the names on the mailboxes through squinted eyes. Her long brown hair tumbled down her back, and she was dressed simply in a green t-shirt and cut-off jeans. She was gorgeous by anyone's standards, and she was receiving a good number of stares from the passers-by. Paul realized with embarrassment that he was one of them. He shook himself out of his daze. Lisa would be waiting for him. As he walked towards the door, though, the woman straightened suddenly and looked at him oddly. "Polly?" she said excitedly. "Lisa?" The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Subconsciously, he had known it was her, but he hadn't dared to hope it could be true. She hugged him briefly, and he returned the gesture. Her arms were certainly firm for someone so small, he thought, as she crushed him against her. She definitely wasn't as big a homebody as he'd thought, and he reflected that making her mad might be a bad idea. "It's so nice to finally meet you in person. I was worried when I couldn't find your name on the mailboxes." Paul could only look at her with astonishment. She was here. She was finally here. Her hands were in his. Her voice was like honey poured over a sonnet. Her hair tumbled easily down the back of her neck in warm, thick sheets. Her eyes seemed to smile at him from under her bangs. She was a vision, a goddess. Paul could feel the blood pumping in his ears as she spoke. The edges of his world were blurring. "Paul, is everything okay?" He sighed, clearing the butterflies from his stomach. "I'm just so surprised you're here." She smiled and placed a delicate finger to her cheek, crooking the other under her chin. "Is it a good surprise?" she asked coyly. He grinned. "The best." "Are you sure I can't make you something to eat?" Paul had easily made enough pasta for 5 people, let alone 2. His attention had been elsewhere, on that perfect goddess that sat in his dining room. She seemed drawn to him too, never looking away, never tiring of his face, as he stood there at the stove, cooking the only dish he knew. Bachelor life was tough, but spaghetti was easy. Oh, no, it's fine. I already ate before I came, she said quickly. Paul spun his fork absent-mindedly as she continued to stare at him. He popped a roll of spaghetti in his mouth and gasped. It was hot. The noodles burned the roof of his mouth suddenly, and his hands groped for his wineglass. She giggled, and he took a long sip as he grimaced at the bitter taste of cheap wine. "Do I distract you that much?" she asked innocently. Paul grinned sheepishly. "Kind of a lot. I hate to think you had to walk all the way here just to see me. You should tell me next time, and I'll—" He remembered something then. "Well, I guess I won't be able to walk you here since I don't think you've ever told me where you live." "No, it's fine. I don't mind. Any excuse to see you," she purred as she dodged the question. They both blushed, and Paul took another bite of spaghetti. His heart was pounding. What was she doing here? Not that he wasn't pleased to see her after a month of conversations, but a woman like this could have any man she wanted. Why would she settle for a lowly cubicle jockey like me, he thought. "So, did you find the place okay?" he asked, hoping to break the silence. "Oh, yeah. It was quite a nice walk. I'm jealous you get to see this every day to work. The stores are likely just opening when you head out, and I can only imagine what kind of smells and sounds you must hear." Paul took another bite and then another as she spoke. When had he told her where he worked? Or for that matter, where he lived? He tried to remember as she went on and on about the scenery, but he just couldn't remember. His face must have said more than he meant it to, because she looked at him and asked, "What are you thinking about so hard, Polly?" And then it was all gone. She laid her fingers across her cheek again and cocked her head just so, and he was putty in her hands. "Oh, nothing. I thought maybe we could watch a movie." "I hope you have something romantic," she said, with a little giggle. "So she just showed up out of the blue." "That's right," Paul said, triumphant. He'd met Frank and Reagan for lunch at one of the sports bars near his apartment. They'd wanted to watch the Bears play, and neither was well stocked for food at their place. The sports bar was packed, likely more Bear fans, and the noise was deafening. It was so surreal. She just showed up, out of the blue, and stayed with me all night. He could feel his face turning red, but he couldn't let them see. "All night, huh?" Reagan said with a grin. Paul laughed. "Not like that. We just sort of sat around and enjoyed each other's company." "Uh-huh," said Reagan, unconvinced. Frank seemed thoughtful, though. "So she just showed up?" Paul looked at him. "Yeah. Funny. Thought you said she was nervous about meeting you." "I guess she got over it," Paul said with a shrug. "Funny how you never mentioned switching addresses with this mystery girl." Paul furrowed his brow. "That's right, yeah. Come to think of it, I didn't remember giving her my address. I suppose I must have forgotten, though. We've been talking for months. It was bound to come up." "And your work, too? Did that come up all of a sudden?" A chill ran down Paul's spine. "Now that you mention it, hey, what's with the third degree here, Frank? Doesn't strike you as odd that this girl just showed up out of the blue without being invited and without being told where you live or where you work? This is Chicago, Paul. Do you have any idea what the chances of meeting someone at a specific time and place with no clue where that place is are? 1 in a million, just like this girl," Paul chuckled. "Be serious, Paul. You may think this is endearing, but we have a word for people like that, and it's called stalker. You—" But he faltered as a shadow fell across the table. Paul looked up and into the wet, moss-colored eyes of his angel. Lisa was there, carrying a glass of beer and wearing a Bears jersey. She had obviously heard the conversation. Paul barely got her name out before she was running for the door of the crowded bar, beer crashing to the floor in a foamy wave. "Lisa, wait! Lisa!" Paul was on his feet and after her in a second. He pushed through the crowd of people, most cursing and shouting in his wake, but as he exited to the street, he found no trace of Lisa. "No," he sobbed, grabbing the building for support. She was gone. She'd run away from him, and now he'd never see her again. His stomach felt like he'd swallowed a hot brick. Tears came unbidden to his eyes. "Dude, I'm sorry," said Frank. I didn't mean to." Paul didn't remember slipping it to the ground, but Frank's hand was reaching for him, and he slapped it away angrily. "Next time, why don't you just keep your goddamn mouth shut?" he shouted as he lurched to his feet and began running for his apartment. Paul sighed as he walked home after another busy day at the office. It had been 5 days. 5 days since his fight with Frank. 5 days since he'd seen Lisa's tear-streaked face. She hadn't been online at all. No emails or visits either, and Paul was beginning to worry that he would never see her again. She had looked so upset at the bar, he wondered if she truly thought he believed Frank's suspicions. Frank. There was another mystery. No one had seen or heard from Frank since Saturday. He hadn't shown up to work all week, and Reagan said there was no answer at his apartment. As mad as Paul had been at Frank for his ill-timed outburst, he couldn't pretend he wasn't worried about him. They had been friends for years, and his disappearance was more than a little unsettling with all the ID intolerance going on. Paul sighed as his key scraped the lock. What was he going to do? He'd lost his best friend and the love of his life in one fell swoop. The red light was blinking on his machine when he got home, and when he pressed it, the voice he expected to hear wasn't there. Polly, it's Lisa. I know I have a lot to answer for, but I was wondering if you'd like to come over so I can try to explain what's been going on. Her address followed, along with some directions. Paul listened to the message 4 times, drinking in the sound of her voice, and there was hurt in it that almost brought Paul to tears. They made him feel guilty as he left his apartment and trekked the familiar path downtown. Lisa lived in a large brick building in one of the nicer parts of the city. He found her apartment easily, and when he knocked, a little voice told him to come in. As he entered, he couldn't help but notice the long red streak up the floor. Paul had never seen blood, but he'd seen enough cop dramas to know what the start of a crime scene looks like. A chill swept over him as he entered. She was sitting on the couch, a fire burning in the grate. She turned to look at him, and her angelic face was a welcome sight. As she spread her arms wide and ran to him, Paul was surprised that he didn't cringe away from her, especially since her hands were caked in blood. I'm so sorry, Paul. I'm sorry for everything, but it's okay now. No one will stop us from being together. Paul saw over her shoulder that the red streak led to the nearby bathroom, and the bottom fell out of his stomach. Lisa, what have you done? Her face clouded up, and tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. I had to, Paul. I had to kill him. He was suspicious of me. He'd been suspicious of me from the start. If he kept digging, he would find out I was the one who broke into your office, and Paul pushed her away gently but firmly. Wait, that was you? I was intrigued by you, Paul. I had to know more. I had to. I had to see you, hear you, know you without you seeing me. I had to be sure, Polly. I had to be sure I could trust you. Lisa, you're the one that's been coming to my window at night, aren't you? She looked away, ashamed. You stole my address, my phone number. You broke into my office just a what, Lisa? What did you hope to gain? She was crying again, and when she looked up at him, he could see her honesty as she answered, You, Paul, you're all I've ever wanted. You're all I ever hoped to gain. His blood ran cold. His breath came out in troubled gasps. He felt like someone was tearing his lungs out. How could this angel be so tainted? A criminal? A stalker? A killer? Why would you do this, Lisa? Why would you... But he stopped. She had taken his breath away again. Her hands had begun to deftly pull behind her hair, bringing her face away from it. Her perfect face had fallen away like a Halloween mask, and she had brushed away the stray strands that clung to her. As the fleshy roll hung from her neck, Paul could see a pill-shaped metal cylinder staring back at him through 2 yellow-tinted eyes. When she spoke, no mouth opened, but her voice was still Lisa's. Because I'm not human, Paul. Because there are people who don't think I deserve a normal life. Paul took a step back, horror spreading across his face. What are you? He breathed, his breath coming out in gasps, like someone had punched him in the stomach and never pulled their hand away. Why, Paul? Don't you remember? I'm Lisa, L-model intimacy servo automaton, and I'm all yours, Polly.